Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, joining you for another Zoom presentation, which someone has informed me we're in the high 70s now in the number of presentations. So I really appreciate everyone being a part of these programs. And if you are watching the recording on YouTube, thank you for joining us that way. If you have any questions and you're watching on YouTube, feel free to put a question down in the comment section, and I will be really happy to come back and provide you that answer as best I'm able. And I'd also encourage you to hit the little subscribe button. That will let you know when new videos are out so that you can keep up with the topics that we're discussing. So thank you again for joining us today. We're going to be talking about two of the really popular small fruits that we grow here in Mississippi and in the surrounding region, blueberries and blackberries. So we're going to get right into it, talking first about blueberries, and I'm going to go into how to plant them, how to manage them, pruning, a little bit about propagation, and we're also going to discuss some insect and disease pests that can cause you some problems if you are growing blueberries. We'll talk about how to identify those problems and how to manage them. So, of course, the first thing that we need to do, just like any other crop that we would be growing, we want to make sure that we are selecting a site to put the plants that are really just going to be ideal for that plant. One of the things that I really commonly say when I'm talking about planting things in the home landscape is that it's a lot easier to adapt what plants you're going to put in a particular area than trying to adapt that area to the plant that you want to put there. So for blueberries, we want to grow those in an area that has a little bit of a soil quality that's a little different than a lot of the plants that we grow in our landscape. Blueberries prefer a pH, or that alkalinity or acidity of the soil, that's a good bit more acid than a lot of the plants that we grow. They're going to grow very well in sandier soils with a pH that's between 4.5 and 5.5. And if you remember some of our previous conversations, a lot of the plants that we are growing in our landscapes really have a preference for a pH that's going to be more like 6.5. But it can be very difficult to modify soils if the pH is already higher than that. Just naturally, it can be a little bit difficult to modify that down. Now, if it's higher because we've added lime, because blueberries are native to here in Mississippi, and a lot of times our soils are just naturally more acidic. So if it's modified up because of lime, that is something that we can address either just by the slow process of it becoming more acidic over time, or by adding sulfur into the soil in order to drop that pH. But ideally, we want that lower pH that's just going to be ideal for the growth of blueberries. They're also going to prefer a well-drained soil. Like I mentioned, they prefer sandier soils. They have a very shallow root system. So having that really well-drained soil is going to be an improvement for them. Oftentimes, one thing we can do is a lot of times we do have heavier clay soils here in Mississippi, is we can add in organic matter to the soil, things like pine bark, which will break up that clay. And because it breaks up that clay and improves soil drainage, it will improve both the growth and the productivity of our blueberry plants. So once we have selected our site, we want to move forward to actually planting the blueberries. And most of the time when we are planting blueberries, we have those in containers. Very often blueberries are going to be sold in a 1-gallon pot, sometimes a little bit larger. Having containerized plants just makes the process of planting much, much easier. There are some instances where you can get blueberry plants as a bare root. It's not something that I see very often at all, if you go down to your local big box store, or if you go to a garden center, what you're likely to see is a plant in a small container. You do want to make sure, just like when you're planting anything else, you do want to make sure that the plant that you have is not root bound. So you want to, and this is something that we discussed when we had a nursery manage here. Take that plant out of that container. Make sure that the roots aren't circling inside that pot. That's a sign that the plant has just been in that container a little bit too long. It needs to have been stepped up. If it is root bound, you can help address that by just cutting those roots. And that will prevent them from just being bound up. And essentially, if it's root bound and you put it into the ground, those roots will just continue to circle and it won't spread out, and you won't have a very vigorous plant. Make sure they're not root bound. Of course, you also want to make sure you dig a good hole for them. Again, put a 50-cent plant in a $5 hole. The hole you dig should be about twice the size of the diameter of that container. And plant spacing is going to depend a little bit on what kind of blueberry you're growing. Now, the vast majority of us are going to grow Rabbiteye blueberries. They're just a larger, a little bit more vigorous plant. And you want to plant those spaced about 5 feet apart. If you have more than one row that you're planting, you can put those rows about 12 foot apart, and that's going to give the plants all the space they need, all the root space they need to be able to take up the nutrients that they need to get. The southern Highbush varieties, we'll talk a little bit more about the difference between these in just a minute, are a little bit smaller plant, a little bit less vigorously growing, and so you can space them about 4 feet apart, so a little bit closer in your plant spacing there. Now, regardless of which kind you're planting, generally you want to put these in the ground in November to December. So good news, we're right in the middle of the time when it is a great time to get out there and put blueberry plants in the ground. That's true for a lot of the fruit trees that we plant in the landscape. And it's possible to plant blueberries in the late winter all the way up until February. But having them planted by the end of December is going to provide them with a lot more time to get that root system settled in the ground, so that as we get into the first year, they're going to be able to grow a lot more vigorously, because during the fairly warm winters we have, that root system has a chance to establish. Now, one thing we do want to do, particularly if we have a tall, spindly blueberry plant in that container, is prune that plant down before we put it in the ground. What we're doing is just evening out the root system and the top of the plant to give that root system a little bit easier of a time as the plant is establishing. So you just want to cut about half the top down, particularly paying attention to any weak branches or any shoots that are growing off to the side or horizontally rather than vertically. So that's all we need to know about planting them. Watering is very important. Our blueberry plants need about 1 inch to 2 inches of water per week. Again, that's very similar to a lot of the other plants that we have in our landscape. Having some mulch, having some organic matter is just going to help keep the soil good and uniformly moist. And I encourage anyone who is going to plant blueberries to consider putting in a drip irrigation system for them. Even if you just have a few plants, it really allows you to evenly apply moisture right down at the root zone of the plant, where it's going to be doing the most good. You're not going to be splashing the plant with a lot of water that can exacerbate some of the disease problems that you might have. And it's really easy with a drip irrigation system to figure out exactly how much water you're applying to the plant. So you can go back to the YouTube video that we have on putting together an irrigation system in the home landscape. One of the things that's a part of that is an emitter, and emitters are rated by the gallons per hour that they put out. Normally, you have a ½ gallon per hour, or gallon per hour, or 2 gallon per hour emitters that you would put onto an irrigation system. And so it's very simple to make sure that we can figure out that we're putting the amount of water that we want to right down into the irrigation, into the root zone of that plant. And we recommend somewhere between about 12 and 16 gallons of water per week. So if you have a gallon per hour emitter, it's pretty straightforward to figure out how long that system needs to run for in order to make sure you're applying the amount of water that you need. One thing that I always make sure that I mention when I'm talking about watering is it's important to keep rainfall in mind when we talk about watering. So, oftentimes throughout the year, we are going to have, rainfall every week. So if you're getting an inch or 2 inches of rainfall, what that means is you really don't need a lot of supplemental water for your blueberries. You can just turn that system off. They do have interrupters that detect rainfall for your irrigation systems that do that automatically. The system that I have at home, the sensor system is just a little rain gauge that I have sitting outside a door. And the automatic system is me going over there and just turning the faucet off so that irrigation system doesn't run when we've had enough rain. But by giving them a good solid water source, you really avoid a lot of problems. Make sure that you're providing the plant everything it needs to get going. As we have discussed a number of times, absolutely the best way to figure out how we want to fertilize any plant that we might be growing in the landscape is by doing a soil test. So, taking soil samples from around the area where you're going to plant your blueberries. I generally recommend doing this on a yearly basis. Bring a sample into your county extension office. We'll send that off to the state lab, and it'll send you back directions on precisely how much fertilizer you need to apply, when you need to apply it, for the ideal growth of that plant. So it's really, really great resource. Only costs $8 to send those samples in. And I really think it is just the best $8 you can spend in horticulture. Just speaking very generally about fertilization for blueberries, of course, we've already mentioned that we want that soil pH somewhere in that range of 4.5 to 5.5. We're not often going to be looking at applying lime to blueberries because they already like the acidic soil that our Mississippi soil tends to be sort of natively. But often we are going to be applying fertilizers in the spring right as they start to grow. And so just as they come out of dormancy and start to put on new growth, and then fertilizing again after harvest. So in the early to midsummer as the harvest ends, kind of dependent on what type of blueberry you're growing. And it's important to note that blueberries are very sensitive to over-fertilization. You don't want to apply more fertilizer than is absolutely necessary or is recommended, because that over-fertilization can cause problems in the growth of the plant. You can oversupply one nutrient or another, and as a result of that, you would need to you would have some problems in the growth of the plant. You also want to avoid nitrate fertilizers. Nitrates can be toxic to blueberries, so you want to use a type of nitrogen fertilizer that does not have that nitrate. So ammonium nitrate would not be something that you would want to use, or potassium nitrate wouldn't be something that you would want to use in blueberries. For nitrogen fertilization, people tend to use either urea, which is usually a 4600 product, And they do that if the pH is just a little bit low. If the pH is a little high, you can use ammonium sulfate. Ammonium sulfate has sulfur in it, and that sulfur can impact the soil by kind of leading to a little bit of a decrease in the soil pH, which can be beneficial. So knowing your soil pH can have an impact on what kind of nitrogen you want to apply to the plant. Now, I am not going to spend a lot of time talking about all of the different kinds, all the different varieties of blueberries or blackberries as we get into that are out there. I am going to show a quick list here in just a second. And I'd refer you to a publication that's through the Mississippi State University Extension Service, which is establishing management of blueberries. It was put out by Dr. Eric Staffney, who is our small fruit specialist, and it is a very good resource to help you choose what variety of either of these plants is going to be suitable for you. Now, broadly, here in the South, we grow two different kinds of blueberries. More often than not, certainly the vast majority of blueberries, certainly for homeowners that we grow, are in the rabbiteye type of blueberry. Those are a native plant down here in the southeastern United States. They are very vigorously growing, very productive, and they're very easy to grow, tend to ripen from May into June. Or July down here in the very south of the state. And again, they grow well in acidic soils, have really good fruit with a really good shelf life. The other kind of blueberry that we can grow is called southern highbush blueberries. Again, just not nearly as common as the rabbiteye blueberries, but the real advantage that we get out of the southern highbush varieties is that they produce earlier in the year than those rabbiteye blueberries. So if you're producing for a farmer's market or something like that, then having that earlier production can be a real benefit to you. They do tend to just be a little bit less vigorous and less productive. They do really require very well-drained soils. Need a lot of organic amendment in that soil to make those plants grow vigorously. And really interestingly, they're a cross between the northern highbush blueberry, which is grown much further north than here in the deep south, and some native southern species, so that they have some of the qualities that that allow them or adapt them to growing down here. One thing that is really important when you are choosing varieties for blueberries is that in most cases you need more than one variety, particularly with the rabbiteye varieties. You need to have more than one variety, and you need to have varieties that are going to bloom about the same time so that they can be cross-pollinated so that you can have productive plants. So with our rabbiteye varieties, and this is taken directly from that publication that I mentioned. Apologies for my phone ringing. You can see some varieties kind of listed by their by the number of chill hours that they're going to have. So the early season varieties, Brightwell and Climax and Premier, and then mid to late season like Tiff Blue and Powder Blue, Centurion and Baldwin. And one thing that's really important to consider when you're looking at a variety of blueberries is, of course, you want to make sure that you get the number of chill hours in your area that's going to make make that plant able to produce where you have it. If you're in a place and you only get 300 chill hours, then growing a variety that needs a fair bit more than that, you may not get good fruit production because of that. So it's important to consider that. It's also important to make sure that you're growing a plant that gets, the right number of chill hours, doesn't get too few chill hours. Because if it gets too few chill hours, it can start to bloom very early in the year. And as a result of that, you can have some frost injury on those early blooms that can really limit the production that you're going to get out of your blueberry plants. And just here on this slide, I have some sort of just suggested variety combinations to make sure that, if you plant a combination of those, you're going to have plants that are overlapping in their bloom period and are going to be able to cross-pollinate each other. So powder blue and tiff blue and Brightwell, or Baldwin and Brightwell or powder blue. I'm not going to go through all of those, but would just be combinations that would work to allow you to make sure that you have that two different varieties blooming at the same time. With their southern Highbush varieties, again, you can see some of the chill hour requirements are a little bit lower here, but generally in that 350 to up to 650. One that's particularly interesting to me, I guess, is the Biloxi variety that was produced originally produced in Poplarville. Its chill hour requirements are just listed as very low. So, it'll certainly start blooming very early. But again, southern Highbush varieties are a little bit better at producing without that cross-pollination. But it is still something that's a good idea to have two different varieties that are blooming at the same time, just to get that cross-pollination. And again, there are some variety combinations that you want to consider. And if you are planting more than one variety, then alternating plants. So you make sure that those plants can kind of communicate between one another, or have the insect pollinators move from one plant to another, is certainly a very good idea. Just to expand a little bit more about the topic of chill hours, down here in the very southern part of Mississippi, very often we're looking at somewhere between 300 and 400 chill hours. I'm at the southernmost point of Mississippi, so kind of in the lowest number of chill hours that we could possibly get. And we really want to aim at those varieties that are going to have much lower chill hours to make sure that we're going to get production. As you move up further north into the state, then you can successfully grow varieties that are going to have higher chill hour requirements. Again, just don't go too low, because those early ripening varieties can have some freeze injury. You also want to pay attention, kind of going back to the idea of site selection. The lowest part of your property is generally where cold is going to settle. So ideally plant in an area where they're a little bit more lifted up, or in a higher area, because you're going to have less problems with cold injury there. And there is a really excellent application that you can get on your phone, or you can access online. It's at webapps.msucares.com, I believe. Or if you go on to the extension.msstate.edu website and search for chill hours, this little application will come up, and you can select your address, or by your current location, by your zip code, and you can actually look at the number of chill hours that you've gotten this year, or you can look at the calculation or averages for everywhere in Mississippi. And I think that's a really important tool for helping you select the varieties that would work really well for you. And again, we're talking about blueberries, but whatever fruits you're thinking about growing, looking at that chill hours app is a really great way to make sure you're getting the varieties that you need. So we're going to talk a little bit about pruning. Blueberries don't need just a massive amount of pruning to keep them growing the way we want them to. We just need to kind of keep them managed and keep them under control. A lot of what we're doing is pruning to kind of get rid of older, less productive wood, and encourage the growth of that newer wood that's going to be able to produce more berries for us. So in terms of when to prune, You know, the general rule is you prune the plants after the feature that you have that plant for goes away. Blueberries follow right into that. So right after harvest and no later than the first week of August is when you want to prune your blueberry plants. And so often what we're going to do is we're going to prune back shoot tips. I have seen some blueberry plants that were 20-foot tall and dozens of feet around, just completely overgrown. And blueberries that are more than 8 or so foot up are going to belong to the birds rather than to me. And I don't begrudge them the ones they take, but I don't want ones that I'm growing just for them. So prune those shoot tips back. That's going to help train that plant lower, encourage it to branch laterally, to be a little bit bushier, so there's more fruit within the range that I'm actually going to be able to pick. We also want to watch the shoots that are coming up from the ground. Blueberries will put up suckers, and so remove any shoots that grow outside of about a 12-inch crown. And by pruning that, doing all of this, before that first week of August, we are going to make sure that plant has plenty of time before the end of the warm weather to put on growth that's going to be productive for us in the next year. If you have a plant that's just starting to grow too big, shear that plant all the way back to about 10 or 12 inches, shorter than the ideal size. For me, I prefer my blueberry plants to be about 6 foot tall. So, shear those back to about 5 foot. And that's going to let them grow back the way, back to that ideal height in the next year. There is, if you do have older wood on the plant, you can remove that as it starts to decline. Again, that's going to encourage new growth. And remove one, somewhere between 1 and 3 of these really old canes each year, just sort of cycling the plant to kind of keep it rejuvenated. If you have a plant that's just gotten completely out of hand, maybe it has been managed in 5 or 6 years. I went to a property once and they had uncovered blueberry plants out of an area they were clearing that had been planted there who knows how long ago. And the trick then is just to do a complete rejuvenation pruning on those plants, cut them down somewhere between 1 foot and 2 foot above the ground, and just allow them to reestablish themselves on new wood. Blueberries do a fantastic job of this, and you really don't see a big interruption in productivity that you're going to see by doing this rejuvenation pruning. Now, there was a question over in the chat area about whether you can take cuttings off of your blueberries and whether you can propagate them. Certainly, blueberries can be propagated. That is a thing that you can do, but you do want to make sure that if you have a patented variety of any plant, then certainly you don't want to be breaking the law by violating that patent. So make sure that we're not talking about a patented variety. And then I'm going to talk about how to propagate them, assuming that we're going to make sure that we are following the legal requirements there. So blueberries can be propagated either from softwood or hardwood cuttings. For softwood cutting, you want to take cuttings about 4 to 5 inches long. You take those in the late spring off of the current season growth. And you should have a little bit of woody tissue on that, but those softwood cuttings are still going to be flexible, and the leaves at the end are going to be still not fully mature. So the leaves won't be at their mature size yet. So when you take that cutting, you're going to remove those lower leaves, leave 2 or 3 of those terminal leaves, and that gives you your softwood cutting. Softwood cuttings, we'll talk a little bit about sticking those in media here in just a second. Hardwood cuttings, we're going to be taking generally from late January into February. Take really good, healthy shoots that are anywhere between 12 and 36 inches long that grew the previous year. And then we can divide those into sections that are 5 to 6 inches long. Use a really good sharp knife. You want to make as clean a cut as you possibly can. And if you have a tip there that has a flower bud on that, you want to remove that flower bud because that'll kind of interfere in the process of getting that plant started. With either a softwood or a hardwood cutting, as the time to get those started, as spring gets around, we're going to put those into a rooting hormone and then just put those down into a good media for growing that cutting. Generally, we're going to put those in about 1/2 to 2/3 of their length. We want to make sure we're leaving one bud exposed above the surface of the soil, and then keep that propagation media really good and moist. It's a good idea to put them in a really good humid environment because we want to avoid them losing too much water. Commercially, you'd have mist beds, things like that, where they're really keeping that humidity very high. But just putting them in, putting them in an area that's going to have more humidity is going to increase the success you're going to have with cuttings. After they form roots, you can start applying a little bit of just a dilute liquid fertilizer. And after they're a little bit stronger, transplant them out into pots in the winter and then plant them the following year. A good recipe for a rooting medium is going to be either a mixture of coarse sand and pine bark and peat moss, all 1 to 1 to 1, or just perlite and peat moss evenly mixed as a really good media to get that propagation media to get your cutting started. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some different diseases and insects that can affect blueberries. Mummyberry is a particularly common fungal issue caused by Monolinea vaccini corymbosa. Well, I'm not going to say that again. I'm just going to call it mummyberry from now on. You tend to first see this by leaf wilting, and the blueberry fruit are affected. And you can see there in that image how they start to kind of shrink down, become kind of a pinkish purple color and get kind of wrinkled. You do want to mulch your plants well. Those mummyberries fall to the ground and they serve as the inoculum for the previous year. So cleaning up all of those fallen berries is really important. Remulching underneath the plant just to give a barrier between any potential disease inoculum and the plant itself. And there are fungicides that are registered for control of mummyberry as well. Really commonly, or a common fungicide called Daconil or chlorothalonil can be used to help manage mummyberry as well. Botrytis blight really commonly shows up after you've had a bout of cold weather, and particularly cold and wet weather, caused by another fungus, Botrytis cinerea. And you can see it by kind of a gray-green fuzzy growth that shows up on the plant tissues, often on the buds. You can see it destroying those blossoms. Of course, keeping the plants dry if you can, having sub-irrigation or drip irrigation rather than watering over the top to prevent the plants from being wet. Offering them protection from the cold if you're going to have a big cold event right at the start of the spring can also really help prevent a lot of damage due to as a result of this particular pathogen. And again, there are fungicides that can be used for this. Captan is a common one that is used. With any fungicide recommendation, it's a good idea to make sure that you take a sample or take a picture, get it to your county office. Make sure you have a good identification of the problem to make sure that we're recommending a fungicide that's going to be particularly effective against the problem that you're seeing. Botryosphaeria stem canker usually shows up as branches that just turn brown and die. Oftentimes seen on branches that are damaged by cold injury or by mechanical damage. and you'll see the kind of a dark colored lesion on the plant on that branch that's dying back. And the thing we need to do to manage this is to prune out those infected limbs and destroy them away from where your blueberries are growing to prevent that disease from being able to spread. Talk a little bit about some insects, and I want to mention here that there's going to be some overlap talking about blueberry and blackberry insects. So as I get to the blackberry section when I'm talking, I may kind of say, you know, this is very much like what you would see in blueberry and move on. This is blueberry bud weevil. It's a small beetle that has a kind of a long snout-like mouth part. It has a kind of nice little reddish brown color. And they bite into the leaf buds. They also lay their eggs in there, and the grubs will feed on the parts of the flower. And then they, you know, that's going to cause blossoms to turn purple and drop off the plant. And then the weevil will pupate in the fallen flower down in the ground, turn back into the adult beetle again. Of course, you want to keep an eye out for damage, keep an eye out and monitor your plants for any of these insect pests to apply an effective control. Spinosad, which is a really good broad spectrum insecticide, can be used for this, along with a range of other insecticide options to control bud weevils. Flower thrips, a really common insect we've talked about in a lot of other contexts. Flower thrips are very small, down to about a 1/16 of an inch, so they can be very easy to miss. So we often see the damage that they do rather than the insect themselves. They do like to feed on flowers. We have their flower thrips. There's the western flower thrips and the eastern flower thrips. So you can detect these. If you want to see the insect itself, get an index card or a nice white sheet of paper and tap the blossoms over that card or paper, and you'll be able to see the insects moving around on it. The other thing you can do is harvest some of those blossoms, put them in a sealed plastic bag, and the heat that's in there will kind of drive the thrips out of that blossom. You'll be able to see them inside that bag. They can also be treated with spinosad very effectively, but really want to keep an eye on this because the damage to the flowers can prevent the formation of fruit. Cranberry fruitworm, that's a picture of the adult down on the bottom. The immature is caterpillar that webs together several of the fruit, feeds directly on these. Just want to cut away any berry clusters that are affected and get rid of them. You do tend to see these on early blooming cultivars, things like climax. But again, just pruning away and getting rid of any infested parts of the plant is a perfectly effective way to manage these. Stem borers can often be a problem. It's a kind of beetle, kind of wasp-like in appearance. You can see it up there. But it has really long antennae. Also see these on a few other plants. Really active in the early part of the summer. And the big problem is the immatures boring into the cane and hollowing out that cane and preventing any nutrients from being transplanted or moved through the plant. There you go. So you just want to cut the plant below where that larva is, below where it's kind of brown and hollowed out. Make sure you destroy those because they do contain larvae that can later cause more problems. Probably the one that we might hear about the most is spotted winged Drosophila. Looks like I may have misspelled that up in the top of the slide. Apologies for that. Very similar to our native fruit flies, but they have a kind of saw-like ovipositor. That's what the female lays eggs with. And they can lay eggs into healthy fruit that can then eat the fruit or be present in the mature fruit on the plant so that you have larvae in the fruit that you harvest, which is not something you want to see. And they have a very rapid generational time. So it might be only 2 weeks or so before, between laying an egg to the next generation being able to lay eggs. So that's a lot of larvae that can potentially damage your plants. It's very easy to construct a trap to figure out if you have this insect or not. You can make that out of a clear drink container or food container and just drill or poke holes. The picture that I have there, somebody took a little piece of screen and hot glued it back to the side of the container and put a little bit of apple cider vinegar down in there, and that will attract the flies. And so you can just check that little trap to see if you have any of these flies. And if you do, you want to make sure we start spraying. Usually permethrin or pyrethrin are the insecticides that are used to control against spotted winged Drosophila. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about blackberries. I'm going to talk fast because I know I'm taking more time than I normally do. Selecting a site for blackberries, want to put them in the full sun. We're back to a plant that really likes that, a little bit slightly acidic, but not nearly as acidic as blackberries, so 5.5 to 6.5. High organic matter, really good drainage is important. And, if you have to establish them in raised beds is perfectly fine. And if you are going to use irrigation, pay attention that, you want to put them somewhere where it's going to be relatively easy for you to put line to. Also keep in mind that you are going to want to trellis blackberries. So you want to select a site where that's going to work in your landscape. The trellis isn't going to be in the way or prevent you from being able to see anything that you would want to see. Here is a long list of varieties. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I direct you to extension.mstate.edu if you want to find out more information about these. Some of the varieties that we have out there are thorny varieties, and blackberries can have some pretty vicious thorns on them. But we also have some thornless varieties that I particularly enjoy for the home landscape, because as I'm messing with them, I don't need to have armor on my hands to go out and have a good time with them. There are some trailing varieties. Most of these are all erect varieties. There are some trailing varieties as well. Sometimes those get called dewberries. The line is vague. There's different species of that get called blackberry sometimes. But I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about those varieties. I do want to mention the primocane fruiting blackberries. They were originally developed in Arkansas. I believe the first were released in 2004. And the big difference between these and the other blackberries is that blackberries, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, generally produce on canes that grew last year. So we would call that the canes that grow this year are primocane. The following year are floricane. And so these produce on that cane that grows in the first year. For commercial production, they haven't been particularly popular because they don't tend to produce well when the temperatures are high. And here in Mississippi or the rest of the South, we do have some pretty good high temperatures, but they are interesting for homeowners that would like to plant them. So you can keep your eyes out for those as a potential variety to use in the home landscape. Planting blackberries can really do this two ways. You can either plant from root cuttings or plant from containerized plants, just like you would plant anything else. If you're going to plant them, you generally want to put them in a hedge fashion on rows, space them about 6 feet apart, and the individual cuttings about 2 feet apart within the row. And you're putting those root cuttings down to a depth of about 3 inches. You can just make yourself a furrow, drop those root cuttings in, cover them, and make that process of planting really straightforward. If you are using plants, you want to plant them the same distance apart, but you want to cut the canes back to about 6 inches. Again, just like we were talking for blueberries, you want to kind of balance out the root system in the top of the plant just to allow that root system to establish really well. Generally planting in late winter, so February is a great time. Though having planted these a number of times, this time of year, down here in very south part of Mississippi, they did just fine. Keep in mind thornless varieties and the thorny varieties are going to be a little bit different. Thornless varieties tend to be a little bit less, maybe a little less vigorously growing, so about 2 feet apart. Thorny varieties about 3 foot apart, and you'll do just fine. You are generally going to trellis your blackberries. It just makes dealing with them a lot easier. Picking the berries from the plant is a lot easier. Keeps them from being blown over by the wind or just dragging the ground because of a heavy fruit load. And you do want to tie them to the trellis as they grow. I use the exact same line that I use to tie my tomatoes up, but there are certainly a lot of products out there that can allow you to do that. I'll refer you back to the presentation we did about vining plants. Generally, when you're making a trellis, you want that top wire to be about 5 feet off the ground, and then have another wire at 2 feet. Some people will add in another wire at 3.5 feet. I prefer to do that, but opinions vary on whether you need that third wire in the middle or not. Propagation, again, make sure we're not talking about a patented variety that would be illegal to propagate, but it is relatively straightforward to propagate blackberries. They can be propagated very easily from root cuttings. I'm going to show a little graphic of that here in a second. So just, you're digging up the roots and cutting them, put those in a damp bag to keep them from drying out. Use pieces that are about 3/16 to 3/8 of an inch and about 4 to 7 inches long. Be mindful that some of the thornless varieties will turn thorny after they have been propagated this way. You can also propagate them by suckers, and we can propagate by tip layering. So just to show you this sort of quick graphic, you have the sucker coming up there. So all you would need to do is dig that up. It's already got roots, so you can just pot that and care for it that way for a while. Until it's doing okay, and then you'd be able to transfer that out into the landscape the next year. With tip layering, we did do a good presentation on plant propagation that I'd refer you back to. But what you're doing is just taking that cane and bending it over down to the ground, usually using a first-year cane for this. You'll generally score the bottom of that. You may add a little bit of rooting hormone, but you just bury that tip with a little bit sticking up at the end, and that will root and produce a daughter plant that can then be separated from the original plant and moved wherever you would like. Pruning blackberries, again, blackberries send up new shoots from crowns. That first year shoot is going to be called the primocane. It grows for 1 year, and in the next year, it will produce fruit. So the first year we call that a primocane. The second year we're going to call that a floricane. And then what we want to do is once that floricane has produced fruit, it's done. We don't need it anymore. So we can remove that following harvest. I'm sometimes forgetful and I may not be able to remember what I've harvested and what I've not. So I always put a little reminder to myself to prune away those old floricanes. I just take old twist ties from bread or other things like that that I have laying around. And after I've harvested from that floricane, I just twist it around that cane. And that's my reminder to myself that I need to come back and prune that away. So you can remove about 6 inches of growth as well from the tip of primocanes. After they get to about 3 to 4 foot high, that's going to encourage them to branch laterally, give you more area where they can fruit. As we get into the winter, you want to remove any dead or weak shoots. And then cut lateral branches off to about 12 inches before growth starts in the spring. All of that's going to give you kind of a bushier plant that's going to have a lot better production. Just to go through some of the diseases and insects for blackberry as well. Anthracnose is a really common disease we've talked about for a number of crops. Tend to start to see this as purplish spots on new shoots. Those purplish spots can expand and girdle the plant. If they girdle the stem, that stem can die back. You'll also see spotting on the leaves. Oftentimes what we need to do is we need to prune a little bit better in order to make sure we have good air circulation through the plant, help keep those leaves and stems dry so that the fungus isn't really able to establish. Using late dormant fungicides applications can help as well. That's applying a fungicide in late winter, so around February, just to kind of provide an interruption. And I also recommend mulching around the base of the plant in order to prevent any anthracnose that may be residing in the soil from being able to splash up in response to rain or irrigation. Orange rust is a very serious disease on blackberries. You can see a picture up there at the top. It is, in fact, just a brilliant orange color. Once that orange rust settles in, it becomes systemic into the plant and really cannot be controlled. So young leaves get covered with small dots. They turn black. You get those orange pustules on there. And what we need to do in response to orange rust is to dig up the plant and get rid of it. So that's just to prevent any infection in other areas or other plants that we might have. Now there is another kind of rust that we see on blackberries called cane or leaf rust. And it does not have this systemic process. And the easy way to tell it apart is that it's yellow rather than being orange. And this is another really important instance where, taking a picture, taking a sample, and bringing it into your county extension office to make sure you have a good ID for this problem is really important. Yellow and orange can be a fine line if you ask me. So making sure that you have a good identification, because, if it's something that you can, treat for, like cane or leaf rust, that's a lot more pleasant of a thing than having to remove the plant because you have orange rust on your blackberries. Rosette is another fairly common disease that we see in blackberries. It's also called double blossom. One thing that is very important is a lot of the varieties that are out there, or you can select for varieties that are resistant to this problem. And I would encourage you to do that. Rosette can be recognized because you wind up with bunchy shoots down at the bottom of the plant in the spring. You see pinkish or green blossoms, which is not what we're going to expect on blackberries. We expect those to be white. And then you'll see the young fruit are just kind of a big mass of gray spores. So what we want to do is just remove that bunchy growth, cut it away, and just kind of interrupt the process of that disease for going through its life cycle. And then if you do have to prune the plants back, you can add nitrogen to support the new growth of the canes to make sure that you're going to be able to get good growth through that first season. Crown gall is a really interesting disease. It's caused by a bacterium called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. It produces these large swellings at the root crown, so right down at the base of the plant. You'll also see that on roots. And unfortunately, it's not something that's particularly easy to fix. So you are going to have to remove the plant in response to this just to prevent it from spreading to other plants. And you're not going to want to plant in the same area because the bacteria does persist in the soil. So it's, unfortunately, it's time when you really need to move where you have the plants, plant something in that area that's going to be resistant to this problem. Insects, aphids are probably one of the more serious issues that we see in blackberries. They can reproduce very, very rapidly. They do transmit several virus diseases, and they suck the sap from the plant. That can reduce its vigor. They also leave a lot of that sugar that they exude after they're unable to digest it. And then you can wind up with sooty mold on the plant, that black fungus that will cover the plant. Fortunately, they're relatively easy to control with horticultural oil. You just need to make sure that you have good coverage of the plant when you spray for them to make sure that you're going to be able to eliminate that population. Because again, they grow, that population can grow very quickly. So if you don't kill them all off, you wind up with a big aphid population. Blackberry crown borer is a kind of moth that masquerades as a yellow jacket. You can see the picture down there at the bottom. They do look very much like a yellow jacket, and they lay eggs down at the base of the plant. And that caterpillar, grows and bores into the plant, just like we talked about for blueberries. Kind of a similar situation. Again, very difficult to control because the insect is inside of the cane. So removing those canes can be important just to control that, just to kind of interrupt that life cycle again. We already talked about thrips once. I'm not going to go into too much detail. You can use spinosad rather than malathion. Malathion works also, but spinosad I think is a perfectly effective control for thrips in most situations. Really kind of the same situation as blueberries, damaging the blossoms and causing deformed fruit. So really want to keep an eye out for these and kind of watch out for damage to the flowers as a way to detect that. Spider mites are another insect that we've talked about a number of times. Really common when we have a really dry, hot period of time. And occasionally we'll also see these after we've sprayed to control something else because we've killed the beneficial mites that were keeping populations of these down. For homeowners, really the best response to this is going to be horticultural oil, though again, you really do need good coverage and you may have to apply several times to get control of spider mites. This is the red-necked cane borer, a beetle that bores into the canes. They have those kind of interesting spindle-shaped swellings or galls on the plant. And to manage this, you just want to remove those plants or remove those canes, just prune that away, and make sure you get rid of them to interrupt the life cycle of the insect. And if you have wild blackberry plants around the area where you have your intentional blackberry planting, removing those just takes away an alternate host for this insect and can prevent you having problems with them. We also do have scale insects showing up on blackberries, very common problem on a range of different plants in the home landscape. Remove heavily infested canes, just get rid of them during the dormant period. Spray with horticultural oil. You will have to spray several times in order to make sure what we're doing with that oil spray is targeting the immatures. So you're going to have to spray several times just to make sure that you've killed the immatures to prevent another population. What you want to look at is look at the new growth of the plant and make sure you don't see scales showing up on that, because the scales have kind of glued themselves to the plant. So even after they're effectively managed, you may still see some of them sort of hanging on, just not doing anything anymore. So make sure you don't see scales showing up on the new growth of the plant. That'll be a good indication to you that you have the problem under control. And I just wanted to close out, this gets thrown in with blackberries because I get asked about it occasionally. Can we grow raspberries down here in the South? And the answer is not very well. Raspberries tend to not thrive very well in the high heat that we have. So it can be very difficult to get them to produce. There's been some effective production using a lot of shade, either shade cloth or just planting them in areas where they're going to get more shade. And there's one variety that has been recommended here called Dorman Red. Has a trailing cane. The fruit, they will produce. The flavor's not the best raspberry you're ever going to get. But if you do want to grow raspberries down here in Mississippi, that is an option for you. All right, with that, I am going to be very happy to take any questions that you have. Again, if you're watching or listening on YouTube, put any questions you may have in the chat area, and I will be thrilled to talk with you or respond to you there. And otherwise, I'm going to be able to answer any questions that you have for those of you who have joined me here live. So I think we